This audio lecture is one that focuses on a few highlights, a few callouts from your lecture guide. In that, you have a quite comprehensive non-audio PowerPoint lecture that really gives you the scope and the scale of this immense period with several different chapters of ancient Greece. And I've also included in our fourth week a few audio lectures from other places that very succinctly and clearly um, cover and analyze some of the lecture guide images. To start off with, in ancient Greece, such a key, such a seminal period that is still so influential and still contributes so much in terms of the artworks and the architectural styles that it brought to the history of art. As with all periods, it's important to remember how key perspective is. Think about what's going on today with statues of classical, in some cases, figures, historical um, leaders who are being toppled all over the world, really, not just in the US, although it seems that we have started a bit of a trend in that regard. Art history as we know it is shaped by who? Shaped mostly by a bunch of British and German archaeologists who were privileged to become archaeologists and considered it a hobby because they could afford to, sitting around and creating classifications of how we regard these ancient civilizations and periods. In the case of Greece, the geometric, the archaic, high classical, late classical, and the final chapter in ancient Greece, the Hellenistic period. So um, always want to keep us mindful of what how what we are looking at has had different representations throughout time. In terms of where we start off, if you remember, there was this period at the end of Crete and the Mycenaean period where we were not really sure what happened between that period and the start of the geometric period in Greece. It may have been a natural disaster, that civilization may have been conquered. It's an unknown. And that is comprised of really a few hundred years before Greek culture starts. Looking at an object, which is the first one on our lecture guide, like the funerary vase, what do we see here? It's something that is a functional object in that it contains a narrative. We don't have the same kind of registers or narrative bands that we have seen in early civilizations, but we have details, we have figures, we have homage to someone who is deceased, who has died. And when we think about Greece too, we're always thinking about this visual order. Composition, symmetry, order is paramount. And Euclid, with his geometric formulas, hence the geometric period in Greece, his name, is the one who really codifies, who creates systems for this idea. So we see in the funerary vase figures that are little heads in the top part of it, depicting what seems to be some kind of a funeral ritual. And it's not the first time that we've seen humans and animals in combination, although with Greece, it does not have the supernatural aspect that it does with the Egyptians, for instance. And again, Greece is important. Greece is key. It marks this shift from the idea of the godheads being something that don't intertwine with humans to a condition, a period of time when humans in a way are more human. And the gods, well, let's just say that they mess with them to a degree. Humans are often at fault. They're closer to the gods in terms of the way this narrative is depicted in a cultural and religious sense. And how does Greece work? It's a city state. It's not an empire. We don't really see that until later on. It's not a river civilization with city-states dotted around coastlines. It's the opposite of those last periods we've studied in a sense. We have standalone units for these city-states. They have their own currency, their own military and customs, trade, and religions. When we get to the sanctuary of Apollo and Delphi, we see these very important geographical places, not unlike Stonehenge in a way, and the original female divinity through the Delphic oracle. Buildings continue to be complex, so temples are being constructed in that sense, not unlike Egypt. These temples are almost exclusively dedicated to one god or goddess, and in the case of goddesses, with the exception of Hera. These houses of worship are ones that have ritual sacrifices done outside, not within the structure itself, to a god and goddess. So, as a devotee, as a lay person, you don't go inside. Only the priests and priests do that. So, devotion on the part of the populace and the members of a religious group worship outside. And then, of course, there are the famous Greek athletic contests and spectacles. When we get to the Parthenon a little later on, we will see this idea of a temple with its own built-in treasury. And this was how the city-states collected their taxes. And we'll mention, as a call out from the Parthenon, you have a separate audio lecture on it, but the importance of Athena, this beautiful gold and ivory statue, unfortunately now defaced. That gold and ivory is no longer intact. That acts as part of the treasury. Getting to the first of our three-dimensional statues here, when we're looking at the centaur. What do we see here? We see a nude male and a centaur in bronze, and we'll talk more about bronze later, which, although marble has some exceptional abilities as a medium in terms of the human ability to render precise detail using that medium, bronze still does a better job of it. And when we get to the warrior, we'll see the difference between the two mediums. So the Greek idea was that there was this primacy of humans. And when we look at a hybrid like the centaur, right, half man, half animal, we are seeing something that is not considered supernatural, or something that might be a godhead, as we see in Egypt, as well as a man and as well as a king. We see a being, we see a creature that's corrupted. So therefore, is the foil to the enemy of that human. And let's look closely at, does it look like they're dancing because their arms are intertwined? They are not, they are struggling. It's a kind of primal archetypal struggle between man and beast. And let's remember again that Greece is so important in terms of a larger narrative arc. It really marks the shift from the idea of humankind that is just subject to gods wreaking havoc upon it, but that there's more of an intertwined relationship between gods and man. Moving to the first of our chores, looking at the Metropolitan. What do we see when we look at this? What is the construction of this being? How are the muscles and tissues arranged on this frame? There's the same kind of stiffness that we see when we're thinking about many Egyptian statues. The way the shoulder blades are constructed, the stiffness of the braids, the eyebrow arches, the way that the eyes sit on the skull instead of in it. And we've got this idea of an ideal male nude that comes from observation, or does it come from an idea of perfect symmetry? When we get to the Anavisis Kore, we see quite a different representation, one that is far more lifelike. We're looking at a statue that looks more familiar in terms of how we think of the human body and the movement of the human body. What's the other thing about nudity during this period that's different? We rarely see female nudes. That's something that's going to occur far later on in the classical period, and when we get there, it's Aphrodite. Male nudes are far more common during this period. What does that mean? The idea of male nudity, particularly there's a difference between the archaic and the classical period with the way male nudity is depicted. Originally, the idea is that it's heroic, that there's something of the heroic warrior, and that ties to the idea too that in their famous competitions and athletic games, that the male participants in those activities were often depicted nude. And sometimes during other very casual social activities, when there'd been a symposium, or even when some classical learning was occurring. For the most part, though, men were not walking around the streets nude, but there is a real difference here. We also see something that is called the archaic smile on the face of the Anavisis Kore. What is that? It's very common to see with both the chorus and the female version chorus that there's this forced, a smile of, as one art historian refers to it, forced cheerfulness. So there's something that looks a little bit fake and pasted on about it, and that is to what the phrase archaic smile refers. The female version of this sculptural tradition and is the cord, and here we see the peplos cord. We notice that there is a difference between coloration between the two. Originally, the statues that we see today, for the most part, and we'll look at some buildings that also feature color, were colored. These things faded over time. And it wasn't until that long ago that art historians and conservationists knew that color was actually a very important part of Greek statuary. This is a far more realistic rendering as we go through the trajectory of statuary at this time. And here we see a good example of what is known as the contrapposto. What is contrappostos? It's the idea of how the figure is represented, the human figure is represented with opposing alternatives. There's tension and relaxation, and this is most commonly represented by the access created from the twist of the shoulders to a bended knee. A quick look here at two of the three orders, as they're called, or styles of Greek architecture, the Corinthian being the third. Classical Greek architecture, the Doric and Ionic columns represent proportions that are based on a mathematical ratio. The Doric is generally the Doric is generally more fluted uh, and stylistically, you can see these sort of frills almost on the top of the columns. The Ionic is generally more elongated. And here we see this idea of how colorful these architectural buildings, monuments, temples were in actuality. Before, over the ages, we lost this coloration that can also be seen in a recreation of, we looked quickly at the Peplos Kore with her, similar to the Anabasis, the more of a real bone, flesh structure and representation. There are images of the Peplos Kore in all her colored glory at a much earlier time. Going back to vases, to looking at these, some of the key vessels that we have on our lecture guide. It's important, the study of these, because Greeks use the surfaces of vases to tell us about themselves. They really use them, as we've seen in earlier generations, but in a way that seems more humanized often now. And they also are imagining the gods to be more like us. So in a sense, they're humanizing the gods. We see different coloration patterns. There is the style of the red versus the black. And that process just really, that is something that just, that categorization is something that refers to the difference in process and techniques. One aspect of which is reducing the oxygen in the kiln when the piece is firing, and the way that the slip painting is done. And slip is just something that refers to liquid clay, so we can think of slip as paint. It's liquid clay used as paint in this technique, and we often see these reversals, a reverse from red to black, and this changes from the earlier periods in Greece into as it progresses into the later ones. This is really one of the finest representations of narratives being told on the surface of these vases at this time. And here we're looking at Achilles and Ajax playing a game. What is this artist, Ezekias, given us here? It's a backgammon-like game. It's a board game, and in which the warrior Achilles has left the battlefield, and he's playing with his buddy Ajax. There are these really, if you look at it closely, extraordinarily clear formal qualities to this representation. Look at how the figures are leaning into the game. Look at how their spears are like V's, creating this really nice compositional element. And the block upon which the game sits, that's mirrored by the blocks upon which these two warriors sit. This very pleasing formal balance composition between angles and curves. Look at how small their feet are in contrast. You can see how absorbed they are by the game. Even though war is raging nearby, they're just taking a time out. You can see how Ajax's jaw looks a little skew and Achilles is a bit tighter. And of course, there's a story behind what is occurring in the playing of this game. Is Achilles winning? Anybody looking at this vase who knows the storyline knows that Ajax outlives Achilles, who dies, becomes a great hero. Um, Ajax wants his armor after he dies. Everyone wants it. There's a contest with Odysseus, who wins, triumphs over Ajax, who is then demoralized. I was the one who was his really great bud. He was my friend, and he throws himself on his sword. So the classical idea behind this, in a sense, is that Achilles always will have the upper hand, even in depth. He won, and Ajax, who throws himself on his sword, would rather die than live with the embarrassment of not being perceived as the chosen one. Looking at some other vases here, there is the Dionysus with Maenads, or maidens rather. And what are they holding? What kind of an exchange are they having? Dionysus is holding a vessel of what wine? Dionysus is Bacchus, the god of wine. And the idea, of course, behind alcohol, wine drinking, is that it lowers your inhibitions, it makes you affectionate. Devotees of Dionysus are primarily women and slaves. So it's it's an interesting contrast to the way that we think of social drinking today. There's also this representation, a youth pouring wine into the kylix, or the vessel, drinking glass of a companion, and this idea of the traditional pederasty of men and young boys, symposiums of philosophy and ideas. Looking at some other beautifully done stylizations in the work of this time, and how proficient the Greeks were, again, at using the surface as a way of creating a tableau, a narrative structure, a storyline for us. Returning to statuary, here is where we see the advantages of bronze and its phenomenal ability to register the tiniest details. As good as marble is as a medium, bronze excels and goes beyond it. With the bronze warrior, we have a figure highly classical, very representative of the classical period as we move into it from the archaic. And here we see that naturalism that evolved from the first metropolitan chorus to the Anabasis, looking remarkably different in terms of relaxed natural posture, even further. And here we see the contrapposto position, again, clearly represented, this shift of weight from one foot in front of the other, and this idea of tension and relaxation. The idea is too that with the contrapposto stance, the sculptor is creating this sense of dynamism in the body. There's tension and relaxation, but there's also a tension created between those two polar opposites, those dynamics. There's one working arm and there's one working leg, and the opposite on the other side. And it also is how we walk, in terms of this cross-body axis being so representative of the human, of this shift from the archaic to the classical period that privileges the idea of naturalism through the contrapposto. And again, the bronze as a medium allows for much greater naturalism. It was the preferred material, medium in Greece, but they had depleted their own over time. Sometimes things made earlier were even melted down. This one here, the warrior, is a fairly recent discovery in terms of archaeology, and it is quite perfect in terms of its representation of order, balance, and harmony. Um, and again, the Greeks really preferred bronze because it just afforded this representation of natural detail that even the finest marble couldn't render. A little bit more about the process here. Um, why is bronze so very naturalistic? If you think about starting with a clay model and the way that you mold with soft clay, that clay is then covered with an external mold and covered with wax. Um, Molten bronze is clings before it hardens to every detail that was formed in that mold. And that's what creates this incredibly lifelike natural form. You can really see the hair, the musculature, the veins. Um, and it makes this idea of symmetry and the shifting of weight in the architecture of the body even more naturalistic and dynamic. The skill with which these kinds of pieces were made is it's really one of the greatest technical achievements of the Greek era, and later too, when we get to Roman bronze working, we see the same kind of decorative details so perfectly rendered with hair, and sometimes even in the finished piece with a chisel. And we can see with the warrior too that the additions that the Greeks and later Romans sometimes use, eyes inset with glass or stones, teeth and fingernails might be inlaid with silver, nipples with copper, all contribute to this bronze statue's lifelike, very lifelike appearance. And again, hollow bronze can get melted down, and that's how, since bronze was in such great demand, the Greeks often recreated it, reused that material. Looking at the Doryphoros sculpture, we again see the contrapposto. We see Polycletus's notion of the canon, or the canon is translated as the measure or the rule. So the rule of how every part must be perfectly proportioned, and we do see that in the Doryphoros, the relationship between each part, the finger to the hand to the forearm, the arm to the torso, are all quite perfectly done. And this is one that certainly adheres to the sculptor Polycletus's treatise, again, a canon or a rule, laying out, describing in writing what he considered to be, and certainly he was correct, I think we'd have to agree, considered to be the most perfectly harmonious and balanced proportions of the human body as it could be sculpted. Another example here, not one we're looking at closely. Just one call out here from the Parthenon, the Acropolis. To begin with, why does everybody spend so much time on the Parthenon? Phidias' master creation that he supervised, his aesthetic vision it represents everything that was important and notable and not just legendary, but what remains today as a template about Greece, the triumph over of these democratic city-states, the political and ideological themes that we still think of as embodying the classic, the idea of what we call classic. And part of it has to do with the centrality of their ideas about at the core of these philosophies was this idea of human proportion and perfect ratios and a sense of balance and harmony. And there's a lot of historical background on that and how this the site of the Parthenon became one of the differing, well, representing different uh, powers politically and socially when we see wave after wave of um, transference through war to different allegiances to different warring states. So, what is the Acropolis? The Acropolis means high city. Um, and this temple is one that is set up originally with some smaller related structures that were removed from the um, capital city of Athens. It was a sacred space. The entire Acropolis was a sacred space, and it was accessible only part of the year to honor Athena. Only Athenian male citizens could go, property owning men. What's notable about Athena, outside of right her birth from her father Zeus's head, so she's someone with a single parent, is that she's an important goddess because she symbolizes so many things. She's not only the goddess of the hunt, like Diana, of war, victory, wisdom, at that point only belonging to men. Not in this case. Because she's a goddess, and she's always shown in armor. She represents too how the Greeks thought about and humanized their gods and goddesses. She was someone who, a goddess who was thought of as a city protector and a patron, the goddess of wisdom, courage, inspiration, civilization, law, justice, strategic warfare, math, strength, strategy, the arts, crafts. She had it all. She was not thought of as sexy in the Wonder Woman sense, but she certainly, in a way, was like a Wonder Woman. So, in this ideology, we have to think too about how the Greeks contextualize, again, humanize gods and goddesses. Yet they're saying we don't want our women gathered here to worship her as a group without male supervision. So there's a bit of a conflicting dynamic there, right? In terms of worshiping this goddess who's so representative of female authority and power and agency, yet not allowing her own gender to be part of that homage. So the Greeks humanize the gods. They're comfortable making them flawed, making them vain, and in some senses, even delusional. If we go back to Babylonia, to the Ishtar Gate, we can think about the scariest thing about women in the eyes of men and represented there is what? Their beauty and their ability to seduce men. So Athena wasn't like that. She wasn't thought of as desirable. She was about respect, not desire, and she has the armor, obviously, to prove it. She was a warrior goddess. And again, her beautiful gold, ivory, bronze, this does not exist anymore. This was scraped off When we think about sacred spaces and we think about the looting of artworks, we can certainly include this important sculpture, one of the many in the Parthenon, in that number. And just looking at Athena here, she's wearing armor again. She's holding a shield in one hand, and in the other, winged Nike. Nike representing victory, right? Well before the shoes came along. And one of the key, there are several representations of Nike here. From the late classical period, the Aphrodite of Knidos. Important and famous for its beauty, and often, also very importantly, as an early example of art created specifically to satisfy the male gaze, right? I said we don't see nudity in females until Aphrodite comes along. Here it is. This is a statue meant to be appreciated from every angle. It was very shocking when it was first commissioned as a cult statue for a temple devoted to the goddess Aphrodite. It depicts her as what? What is she doing? She's preparing for her ritual bath. Ritual baths being something that were often thought of as restoring purity, cleansing the self, not to be confused with the idea of purity and virginity, just the idea of restoring her more commonplace, everyday purity. And she's discarded her drapery, right? Her garment with one hand, and with the other, she's quite modestly shielding her genitals. So, also interesting because her hands are placed, or the one hand, in a motion that it simultaneously shields her pubic area, but it also draws attention to the exposure of her upper body. And certainly Praxiteles, when Praxiteles created this around the 4th century, it was one of the first, of course still is today, life-size representations, again, of the nude female form. And it also, we can think about it as displaying an alternative to this idea of male heroic nudity. It brings another perspective to that notion, to that idea. This original, it's important to note, as with so many other key sculptures, it's so important that we have representations of them because this one no longer exists, the original, although many copies do. The Romans being assiduous and ardent copiers of Greek statues, as well as many other aspects of that culture. And to the point where we often refer to the two as Greco-Roman culture. Again, this is a body bending in the classical contrapposto position. It's a perfect representation of that relaxed, bent knee. And this Aphrodite really established, being a first of its kind, a canon, again, a rule for the proportions of the female nude to follow. And it inspired, as I said, many copies of that, one of which is in the Vatican and many of which are in other parts of the world in museums. The Roman copy, was not quite thought to match the beauty of the original. Another side fact about this is that it was thought that Praxiteles was used a courtesan, a famous courtesan at that time, as a model for the statue, and this added to the brouhaha, to the gossip that surrounds the origin. The goddess Aphrodite herself being, right, the goddess of love. And there was a poem at the time that went something as we have it in posterity, along the lines of Aphrodite herself quoting this poem as Paris, another god, Adonis, and Anchises saw me naked. These are all I know of, but how did Praxiteles contrive it? So there are still so many representations today of the way that we consider the gods and how the gods enter into our own, not just nomenclature, our own vocabulary, but how ideas of them inform the way we look at the creation of warriors, creation of avatars, for example. Today they may be more animated, but the way that the human body was rendered animate, looking lifelike, is one that occurred during this period in Greece.